My name is Lauren Carter. I'm 29 years old, and 5 days before marrying the man I loved, his powerful family blindsided me with a prenup and an ultimatum: sign it or the wedding is off. What followed would push me to the edge, testing how far I was willing to go to protect myself. They thought I was a helpless bride to be they could control, but what they didn't know was I had $9.2 million, a thriving company, and the kind of proof that could shatter their perfect image. By the end of this story, you'll see exactly how I turned their threats into my advantage and why they'll never underestimate me again. But it all started with one invitation I should have refused. 5 days before the wedding, I woke up to the familiar sound of rain tapping against my apartment windows in downtown Denver. My phone was already lighting up with messages from the wedding planner, the florist, and my maid of honor, all needing quick decisions. I was halfway through answering an email when a new message came in. It was from Margaret Whitmore, my future mother-in-law, inviting me to join her for afternoon tea at the Whitmore estate. It wasn't a suggestion. Margaret didn't make suggestions. I told myself it was probably just about final wedding details, maybe a seating chart issue or some last-minute family tradition. Still, there was a twist in my stomach as I drove through the long winding road that led to the estate. The Whitmore home was perched on a hill, an imposing stone mansion with perfectly manicured hedges that looked like they'd been trimmed with a ruler. The moment I stepped out of my car, the air felt different, cooler, heavier, as if the house itself was watching. Margaret greeted me at the door with the kind of smile that could be mistaken for warmth if you didn't know better. She was dressed in a cream cashmere sweater and pearls, her hair pulled into a flawless chignon. Beside her stood Charles, my future father-in-law, tall with the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller. Andrew wasn't there. That alone made my pulse quicken. We moved into the sitting room where the table was already set with china teacups and delicate sandwiches that looked too perfect to touch. Margaret poured the tea herself, her movements precise, and then slid a thick cream-colored envelope toward me. Charles didn't sit. He stood behind her, hands clasped, watching me with eyes that gave nothing away. I opened the envelope and began to read. It was a prenuptial agreement written in dense legal language that didn't require a law degree to understand. Every clause was tilted in their favor. In the event of a divorce, I would walk away with nothing from Andrew's assets, and anything we built together would be absorbed into the Whitmore holdings. Even my company, Summit Path Learning, would be partially claimed as marital property tied to Andrew's name. There were clauses about limiting my say in any real estate purchases and restrictions on what I could inherit if Andrew passed away before me. It wasn't a partnership, it was a trap. Margaret's voice broke the silence. She said this was standard in the Whitmore family, a tradition meant to protect the family legacy. Charles added that it would be best for all involved if I signed before the wedding so there were no misunderstandings. His tone made it sound less like advice and more like an order. I asked if Andrew knew about this. Margaret's eyes flickered for a moment, and she said of course he did. That hit me harder than I expected. Andrew had been there for every cake tasting, every late-night phone call about guest lists, but he hadn't said a word about this. My chest tightened. I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. Margaret smiled again, that same polished smile, and said the wedding would have to be called off. It was that simple. The tea in my cup had gone cold. My hands itched to leave, but I forced myself to stay composed. I folded the agreement back into the envelope and placed it in my bag. Margaret sipped her tea as if the conversation was over. Charles finally sat down, but his eyes never left me, as if measuring my reaction. I stood, thanked them for the tea, and said I needed time to review the agreement. Margaret's smile didn't fade, but her voice cooled. She said she hoped I would make the right choice for the family. Charles walked me to the door without another word. The drive back felt longer than usual. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low over the city. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, Andrew's silence, looming larger with every mile. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Somewhere between the estate and my apartment, the excitement I had carried for months drained away, replaced by a sharp, simmering anger. When I pulled into my parking garage, I didn't go upstairs right away. I sat in the car staring at the envelope on the passenger seat. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrew asking how tea with his parents had gone. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering, but I didn't reply. Not yet. I picked up the envelope, slipped it under my arm, and finally went upstairs. Inside my apartment, the city lights were just beginning to glow through the rain-speckled windows. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water. My reflection in the window looked steady, but inside I could feel the first sparks of something shifting. It wasn't just about the prenup, it was about what it meant. And I knew deep down this wasn't the last time the Whitmores would try to control me. The only question was how far they were willing to go. By the time I pulled back onto the main road, the rain had settled into a steady drizzle, the kind that blurred the edges of the city lights. I kept my eyes on the lanes ahead, trying to push the afternoon out of my mind when I noticed a dark SUV in my rearview mirror. It had been behind me since I left the Whitmore estate. At first I told myself it was just traffic, but every turn I made too. The driver kept a steady distance, close enough to notice, but not enough to be obvious. I tightened my grip on the wheel. Denver's streets can be winding this time of year with slick pavement and sudden dips. I changed lanes twice hoping it would pass me, but it didn't. My heart started to pound in that slow, heavy way that feels more like a warning than fear. As I turned onto the quieter stretch leading toward my apartment, the SUV stayed with me. That's when my brake pedal sank too far under my foot. I pressed again, harder this time, and felt almost nothing. The car didn't slow the way it should. A cold wave went through me. I tapped the brake repeatedly, but the pedal was loose, useless. The upcoming curve was sharper than I remembered, and beyond it was a deep drainage ditch. My pulse roared in my ears. I downshifted instinctively, forcing the car to slow by engine resistance. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt. My shoulder hit the seatbelt hard as the car swerved toward the ditch. Out of the corner of my eye, headlights from another vehicle came into view, blocking the side road ahead. It was a small silver hatchback, and it stopped right in my path as if to force me to a halt. I jerked the wheel toward it and braked again. This time the car shuddered and skidded, finally grinding to a stop just feet away from the ditch. I sat there for a moment, breathless, staring at the windshield wipers dragging rain back and forth. My door opened suddenly, and Evelyn Brooks leaned in, her blonde hair plastered to her face from the rain. She looked just as startled as I felt. "Lauren, are you okay?" Her voice was sharp, urgent. She glanced at my brake pedal and then crouched to look under the car. She knew cars better than anyone I'd ever met. Evelyn's dad owned a repair shop in Aurora, and she'd been under the hood of a car since she could walk. "Something's off," she muttered, then called over her shoulder. "Your brake line's been cut. Clean cut. That's not wear and tear." I blinked at her, trying to process the words. "Cut, you mean? Someone did this on purpose." She looked at me like she wanted to choose her words carefully, then straightened up. "I'm saying you shouldn't drive this car until it's inspected properly. And you need to think about who knew you'd be out here today." The image of the dark SUV flashed in my mind. I turned to point it out, but the road behind us was empty. It was gone. Evelyn's voice softened. "Let's get you home. I can have your car towed to my dad's shop tonight. No charge." I nodded, still too rattled to argue. We got into her hatchback, the heat blasting as she drove me back into the city. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made every shadow feel heavier. When we reached my apartment, she parked out front and looked at me seriously. "I know you're about to get married, but if something feels wrong, you need to trust your gut. People get bold when money and power are involved." I swallowed, thanked her, and promised I'd let her know what the mechanic found. She waited until I was safely inside before pulling away. The moment the door shut behind me, I reached for my phone and dialed Rachel Owens. She picked up on the second ring, her familiar voice cutting through the quiet. "What's going on? You never call this late unless something's wrong." I sank onto the couch and told her everything, from the prenup over tea to the SUV to the brakes. My voice wavered more than I wanted it to. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Lauren, this isn't some coincidence. You need to take this seriously. Don't go anywhere alone for now, and don't get back in that car until you know exactly what happened." I told her Evelyn thought the brake line had been cut. Rachel went silent for a beat, then asked if I'd told Andrew yet. Number. And I'm not sure I want to until I know what I'm dealing with. She exhaled sharply. Okay. Then you need to get it checked tomorrow first thing. And if you see that SUV again, take a picture, call me, call the police, whatever you have to do. Her voice carried that steady certainty she'd always had since our college days, the kind that made me feel anchored even when the ground was shifting under me. We talked a little longer, mostly her reminding me to lock my doors and keep the lights on. After we hung up, I walked to the window and looked down at the street. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the street lamps. No sign of the SUV. No sound but the distant hum of traffic. I double-checked the locks, then set the prenup envelope on the coffee table. Between that paper and the brake line, the air in my apartment felt heavier than it should. I told myself it could be nothing. But the truth was, some part of me already knew better. The night felt unnaturally still, the kind where every sound seems louder than it should be. My apartment, usually my safe little cocoon above the coffee shop, felt foreign. I moved from room to room with no real purpose, glancing at the shadows in the corners like they might move if I looked away. The prenup envelope lay untouched on the coffee table, its cream-colored paper almost smug in the lamplight. I tried to distract myself. I made tea, scrolled aimlessly through my phone, even turned on the television, but every thought I had looped back to that moment on the road. The jolt when the brake pedal sank to the floor, the wild swerve toward the ditch. Evelyn's voice shouting my name as she appeared out of nowhere. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Evelyn. Cars at my dad's shop. I'll let you know. Her words were simple, but they carried an undertone I didn't like. Sleep never came easy that night. I lay in bed listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing on the street below. At some point, the clock crept past 3 a.m., and I gave up on rest entirely. By morning, the unease had settled into something colder resolve. I showered, dressed, and forced myself through a normal workday at Brightpath, though I barely remembered a single meeting. My staff probably thought I was distracted by wedding stress. Let them think that. Just after 5, my phone rang. Evelyn. Lauren, I don't know how to say this without freaking you out, but the brake line was cut. Clean cut. Nowhere, no corrosion. I sat back in my chair, the edges of my vision blurring for a second. You're sure? Positive? My dad says it's the kind of precision you don't get from an accident. I rubbed my forehead. Could it have happened while it was parked? She hesitated. Yeah, but only if someone had access to where you keep it. The image of my car in the apartment garage flashed in my mind. Security cameras. I made a note to check with the building manager. Thanks, Evelyn. I'll figure out what to do next. When we hung up, I just sat there staring at the darkened screen of my phone. The logical part of me wanted to call the police, file a report, hand this over to someone trained to handle it. But another voice, quieter but sharper, reminded me of Margaret's perfectly composed expression as she slid the prenup across the table. It whispered that if I involved the police too soon, I might never get the truth. That night, I decided to talk to Andrew. We met at a little Italian place near his office in downtown Denver, a spot we'd gone to often in the early days. He was already there when I arrived, tie-loosened, glass of red wine half finished. I slid into the booth. He smiled like nothing was wrong. Something happened yesterday, I began. After I left your parents' place, my brakes failed. His eyebrows rose. Failed. The mechanic said the brake line was cut. For the briefest second, something flickered across his face, shock, maybe guilt, before he masked it. Lauren, I didn't know, I swear. Do you think your parents could have had anything to do with it? He leaned back, exhaling. My mother. She can be very protective of the family's assets. Sometimes too protective. Too protective, I repeated, my voice flat. This isn't hiding silverware before the cleaning staff comes. Someone could have been killed. He reached across the table, took my hand. I promise you I'll talk to them. But he didn't ask the questions an innocent person might where it happened who saw whether I was okay. He moved the conversation back to wedding details like he could smooth over the jagged edges with discussions of centerpieces and wine pairings. I nodded at the right times, but inside the gap between us felt like it was widening. By the time I got home, the city had gone quiet again. I was halfway through pouring a glass of water when my phone lit up with an unknown number. "Lauren, this is Olivia Harper." It took me a moment to place her the Whitmore's housekeeper for as long as I'd known Andrew. I didn't have a chance to ask why she was calling. "You need to be careful," she said quickly. "And don't drink anything they hand you." My pulse jumped. "What are you talking about? I can't say more." "Just trust me." There was a faint noise in the background, like someone else in the room with her. Then the line went dead. I stood there, glass still in my hand, listening to the silence settle back in. Somewhere between the prenup, the cut break line, and Olivia's warning, a picture was forming. It wasn't complete yet, but one thing was certain. Whatever game the Whitmores were playing, it had just turned dangerous. The next morning, I woke up with the same knot in my stomach I had fallen asleep with. There was no more pretending this would blow over on its own. If I didn't start moving, they were going to keep tightening the noose until I had nowhere left to breathe. I made a quick call to Harold Bennett, my late grandfather's longtime friend and the attorney who had handled his estate. He picked up on the second ring, his deep voice steady as ever. "Lauren, you sound tense. Come by the office. We'll talk." By the time I parked in front of his brick building in downtown Denver, my coffee had gone cold in the cup holder. Harold was waiting in his corner office, sunlight spilling over the polished oak desk. He rose to greet me, his eyes sharp behind his glasses, scanning me in that way he did when he already knew I was in trouble. I sat, exhaling slowly. I told him everything. The prenup meeting. The break line. Olivia's warning. The flicker in Andrew's expression when I confronted him. When I was finished, Harold leaned back, tapping a pen against his notepad. "This is serious. And it's connected." "I have no doubt." I nodded. "I don't know how far they'll go, Harold." "That's exactly what we're going to find out," he said. "We'll address the prenup formally, but I also want you to speak with someone I trust." Mark Reynolds. Former police, now private investigator. Discreet, thorough, and not afraid of powerful families. I hesitated. "Would that make me look paranoid?" "It will make you look alive," he said flatly. We moved on to the prenup itself. Harold had already seen enough of these to know when they were designed to box someone in. This one was worse than most. Full forfeiture of any marital assets if I divorced, no claim to any income Andrew earned, even a clause requiring me to vacate our home within 10 days if the marriage ended. "They want to strip you bare and leave you with nothing," Harold said, his tone cold. "Which tells me they think you have something worth taking." I looked him in the eye. "I do." His brow arched slightly. "Go on." I told him about the $7.7 million I had inherited when my grandfather passed and the $1.5 million in equity from my company Bright Path Learning. How I had kept it quiet because I didn't want to attract people who saw dollar signs instead of me. Harold's pen stilled. "They don't know." "Not yet." "Good, that's leverage. We keep that card close until we need it. If they think you're vulnerable, they'll overplay their hand. That's when we move." Something in his voice steadied me. For the first time since the brake line incident, I felt like I wasn't standing alone in the dark. We arranged for me to meet Mark Reynolds that afternoon. Harold's assistant Claire handed me a folder with his contact info and a brief history. Former homicide detective, left the force after a high-profile corruption case, now ran his own investigations firm out of a modest office near Union Station. When I walked in, Mark was leaning against his desk, a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. "Harold already filled me in," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Why don't you tell me your version?" I recounted the events again, this time focusing on the details. Where my car was parked, what time I left the Whitmore estate, who knew my schedule. Mark asked precise, clipped questions, jotting notes in a small leather book. "Brake lines are cut for one reason," he said finally. "To kill someone or send a very loud message. Either way, it's not a bluff." A chill prickled at my neck. "I'll start with your building security footage," he went on. And I'll dig into anyone on the Whitmore payroll who might be willing to get their hands dirty. I left his office with a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear because now it was real relief because at least someone was watching my back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, Harold's words echoing in my head. Keep the leverage. Time it right. I poured myself a glass of wine, but Olivia's warning about not drinking anything they gave me kept replaying, and I set it down untouched. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrew. Dinner tomorrow. I stared at it for a long time before typing back a simple, sure. The walls of my apartment felt closer than usual as I turned off the lights. I didn't know yet how this was going to end, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done waiting for the next hit. The next move would be mine. Morning crept in, slow, pale light spilling across my apartment floor as I sat at the kitchen counter staring into a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. My phone vibrated against the counter, the sound sharp in the quiet. It was Mark. His voice came through steady but low, like he didn't want anyone on his end to overhear. I need you to come by my office. There's something you should see. 20 minutes later, I was standing in the cramped space above a locksmith shop that Mark used as his base. He had a laptop open, the screen paused on a grainy still from a parking lot security camera. It was my car parked exactly where I'd left it the day of the break incident. Off to the side, a figure approached. Mark hit play. The man moved quickly, but without panic, glancing once over his shoulder before crouching near my front tire. His jacket caught the light just enough for the embroidered crest to glint for a second. Mark froze the frame and zoomed in. The words Whitmore and Burke sat in neat gold stitching over the man's chest. My throat tightened. That's Andrew's firm. Could be one of their staff, Mark said, or someone they pay to wear their colors. Either way, this wasn't random. They wanted you to recognize the message. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to catch a glimpse of his face under the baseball cap pulled low. The brim shadowed his features completely. 30 seconds later, he walked away as if nothing had happened. Mark closed the laptop gently. I'm running this past a couple of shop owners in the area, see if they remember him. I'll also check DMV records if I can get a better angle from another camera. It's not going to be easy. People who do this kind of work know how to keep their names clean. On the drive back, my phone rang again. Rachel's name lit up. Her voice came through urgent, the kind of urgency that told me she was on the verge of something big. I've been digging through some old court filings, she said, and I found something interesting. Whitmore and Burke have represented a company called Garrett Holdings for years. On paper, it's a real estate investment group, but I've been hearing rumors, money laundering, shell accounts, offshore transfers. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. Do you think Andrew knows about it? If he doesn't, his parents definitely do, Rachel replied. There's a case from 2 years ago involving one of their properties filed, then sealed, then dismissed. No record of testimony, no paper trail except the docket number. That's not normal, that's power. I pulled into my garage and shut off the engine, but I didn't get out. The silence pressed in thick as smoke. The thought that the firm might be connected to something criminal shifted the ground under my feet. This wasn't just about family wealth and prenups anymore. It was about the kind of connections that could ruin people without leaving fingerprints. Rachel's voice cut back and firmer now. You need to be careful, Lauren. People protect this kind of operation with more than just lawyers. I saw again in my mind the way the man in the jacket had moved, efficient, calm, precise. Someone had sent him to make sure I wouldn't be able to stop on that road. And now with Garrett Holdings in the picture, I was beginning to understand why. That night, I spread everything out on my dining table, the still frame Mark had printed from the footage, Rachel's notes on Garrett Holdings, my own scribbles from conversations with Andrew. I studied the photo until the edges of the paper felt worn under my fingertips. Somewhere in those shadows, in the curve of that man's shoulder, was a thread. If I could tie it to Whitmore and Burke and then to Garrett Holdings, I could pull hard enough to unravel everything. I called Mark again. If you find anything, employment records, building logs, anything that puts him inside Whitmore and Burke, I want to know before you even hang up with your source. You'll be the first call I make, he said. After hanging up, I stood at the window looking down at the empty street. The fear that had been sitting in my chest for days hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer the kind that froze me in place. It was sharper now, almost electric, and it pointed in one direction. For the first time since the prenup meeting, I felt the faintest flicker of control. I didn't know exactly how this would end, but I knew where I needed to start. And this time I wouldn't be waiting for the Whitmores to make the next move. The next morning, I drove across town to Harold Bennett's office, the late summer sun glinting off the hood as if it could burn away the unease still sitting in my chest. Harold greeted me with that calm, measured expression. He always had, the kind that made you feel like no matter how bad the storm was, he'd already charted the way through. We sat across from each other at his polished oak desk, a yellow legal pad between us. I laid out the pieces, the prenup, the break sabotage, the possible criminal ties through Garrett Holdings. His brows drew together just slightly as he listened, tapping the end of his pen against the pad. "All right," he said finally. "Here's how I see it. We draft our own prenup. One that protects both of you equally. Fair terms, no hidden clauses. You present it to them as if it's your good faith effort to compromise. That way, if they refuse, it's clear they're not interested in fairness, only control." And the break incident, I asked, "Do we bring it up?" "Not yet," he replied. "But we keep it in the chamber. If they push too hard, we let them know we have evidence of sabotage and that the police could be involved. That's leverage." I nodded slowly, feeling the shape of the plan take form. It was something concrete, something I could act on instead of just react to. By midday, we had the first draft on paper. Harold's language was sharp but reasonable, every term balanced like the scales carved into the front of the courthouse. Looking at it, I almost smiled. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a statement that I wouldn't be bullied into a corner. Later that afternoon, I met with Mark at the cafe near his office. He'd already heard from Harold, so I didn't need to explain the plan. Instead, we talked about the second layer, how to weave the break line incident into the negotiation without tipping our hand too early. "If they think you're scared, they'll keep pressing," Mark said, stirring his coffee without looking up. "But if they sense you might have the power to ruin them publicly, they'll tread differently. You want them uncertain." Before I could answer, the bell over the cafe door jingled and Evelyn Brooks walked in. She spotted me instantly and made her way over, her dark hair pulled back, a light jacket thrown over her arm. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said as she slid into the seat next to me. "Not at all," I said, motioning for her to sit. "What's up?" She glanced at Mark, then back at me, lowering her voice. "This might sound strange, but when I was younger, I used to hang around the Whitmore estate with my cousin. One summer, we found an old tunnel. It starts in the cellar of the carriage house and comes out on Birch Street a few blocks away. We thought it was for deliveries back in the day, but it's still there." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And it's accessible?" "Last I checked, yes. There's a padlock, but it's nothing fancy." I sat back, processing that. A hidden exit from the estate wasn't just interesting, it was insurance. If I ever needed to get out of a meeting there without being seen, it could mean the difference between walking away and not walking out at all. Evelyn leaned forward. "I know it sounds dramatic, but if you're meeting them on their turf, you should know every way in and out." She was right. I asked her to draw a quick map from memory, marking the entrance and the exit. Mark studied it, committing the details to memory. "That's your back door," he said finally. "We don't use it unless we have to, but knowing it's there changes the game." By the time Evelyn left, the three of us had the skeleton of a two-tiered plan: the public face, the fair prenup that made me look cooperative, and the shadow hand ready to play the break evidence and use the tunnel if the situation turned. That evening, I spread Harold's draft across my kitchen table again, tracing my fingers over the clauses. Somewhere out there, Margaret and Charles Whitmore thought they still held all the cards. They didn't know I was holding a few of my own now, and I wasn't afraid to use them. I folded the draft neatly, slipped it into a plain envelope, and set it beside my bag. The next meeting with the Whitmores was coming, and when it did, I would be ready not just to face them but to walk away if I had to, without a single glance back. The rain had already started by the time I pulled into the parking lot of the cafe. Seattle's streets glistened under a curtain of drizzle, and the smell of wet pavement clung to the air. I sat in my car for a moment, the envelope resting in the passenger seat like a silent witness before I finally grabbed it and stepped outside. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as I walked in, brushing droplets from my coat. I chose a corner table near the window where I could see the street. The place was quiet except for the hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of conversation from a couple of students huddled over laptops. I ordered a plain black coffee, more to give my hands something to do than for the caffeine. My eyes kept darting toward the door. Andrew arrived exactly on time, wearing a navy wool coat over his suit. His hair was slightly damp from the rain, and there was a careful neutrality in his expression. He spotted me right away and walked over, setting his briefcase down before taking a seat. "You wanted to talk," he said, his voice calm but carrying a hint of guardedness. I leaned forward, fingers wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "There's something I've kept from you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted us to be about us. But now, after everything with your parents, I can't keep it to myself anymore." His brows drew together slightly. "Go on." "I own $9.2 million in assets. 7.7 from my grandfather's estate and the rest from my stake in Bright Path Learning." For a moment his eyes flickered with surprise. He didn't speak right away, as if recalculating everything he thought he knew about me. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That's a lot to drop on someone over coffee, Lauren." "I know. I kept it quiet because I didn't want money to define our relationship. But your parents' prenup, it was designed to wipe me out completely if anything went wrong." I reached into my bag and placed the plain envelope in front of him. "This is the prenup I'm willing to sign. Harold Bennett drafted it. It's fair, Andrew. It protects both of us equally." He opened it and began to read, his gaze moving steadily down the pages. I watched him closely, noticing every shift in his expression. The rain streaked the window beside us, blurring the shapes of cars passing outside. When he finished, he set the papers down. "This actually safeguards me too. It's not one-sided like the one your parents gave me," I finished for him. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. "You know they're going to hate this." I met his eyes. "I'm counting on it. Because if they reject it, they'll be showing us exactly what their real motive is." He ran a hand through his hair, glancing briefly toward the window before looking back at me. "You're asking me to stand against my parents. I'm asking you to stand with me. There's a difference." The silence stretched for a beat too long, but then he reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine before settling over them. "Okay, I'll do it." The relief I felt was real, but it was laced with caution. Promises made in a warm cafe were one thing. Promises kept in the cold pressure of the Whitmore estate would be another. We talked for another 40 minutes, working through the plan. He would arrange the meeting for the day after tomorrow. We'd present the draft calmly together, framing it as a fair compromise. But if they pushed, I had the break line evidence and a willingness to walk away without hesitation. At one point, Andrew asked about the break line. "Do you really think my parents would?" I met his gaze evenly. "I think someone connected to them would. And I'm not willing to gamble my life to find out the hard way." He didn't argue after that. When we left the cafe, the rain had softened to a mist, the sky low and heavy. He walked me to my car, his hand lingering at the small of my back. For a moment it almost felt like before, when it was just the two of us planning a wedding without the shadow of his family looming over us. But as I slid into the driver's seat and watched him walk away, briefcase in hand, I knew that moment was fleeting. The real test wasn't in the promise he'd made here. It was in whether he'd keep it when the Whitmores started playing their game. And something told me their next move would be anything but gentle. Andrew called the next morning to say the meeting was set for Friday evening. The Whitmores preferred dinner at the estate, a family discussion as he put it, though we both knew it would be nothing of the sort. I spent the next 2 days preparing like I was going into a negotiation where my safety, my future, and my dignity were all on the line. The contract Harold drafted went into a slim leather folder. Behind it, I stacked the summary of my assets, every figure verified and current, and tucked in Mark's concise report on the break line Sabotage. I reread every word until I could recite it in my sleep. Evelyn's directions to the old service tunnel stayed folded in my coat pocket, a quiet insurance policy in case things turned ugly. By late Friday afternoon, the sky had gone pale with low clouds and a biting wind rolled in from the sound. I drove up the winding road toward the Whitmore estate, passing the manicured hedges and the wrought iron gates that swung open without hesitation. The mansion's white facade glimmered faintly in the fading light, each tall window spilling gold across the gravel drive. Evelyn was waiting just inside the side entrance, her eyes moving quickly over me as if checking for signs I might have changed my mind. Her voice was low when she said, "The door to the tunnel is still where it was behind the laundry in the east wing. Just remember, it's narrow and dark, but it leads straight out to the alley on Birch Street." I gave a small nod. Hopefully I won't need it. She pressed her lips together, unconvinced. Andrew met me in the grand foyer. He had dressed deliberately charcoal suit and no tie, a middle ground between formality and approachability. His hand touched my arm briefly, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I saw the man I had fallen in love with. The dining room was set as if for a holiday. Candles flickered in heavy silver holders, the crystal gleamed, and the scent of rosemary and roasted meat lingered in the air. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her posture sharp as a blade. Charles was beside her, a glass of red wine in hand, his gaze fixed on me the moment I entered. Across from them, Andrew's younger sister Lily offered a polite but wary smile. Margaret's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Lauren dear, I must say you do clean up well. Not bad for, well, considering your background." I kept my tone level. "Good evening, Margaret." We took our seats. The first course was served, though I barely touched mine. Margaret filled the silence with small talk laced with subtle jabs. She mentioned charity galas, the kind of social circles I might find intimidating, and at one point remarked how fortunate I was to be marrying into stability. Then she leaned back, eyes bright. "I suppose we can dispense with the niceties. We have the contract here." Charles reached into a folder beside him and slid a crisp document across the table. "The old prenup." His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "We've reviewed it again and stand by its fairness. It would be best for all involved if you sign tonight." I didn't reach for it. Instead, I placed my leather folder on the table and opened it slowly. "This is the only agreement I will sign. It protects us both equally. It's fair. And if this wedding is to happen, this is the version that will be in place." The room shifted. The candlelight seemed to catch on every polished surface, too bright, too hot. Margaret's smile thinned. "And if we say no," I met her eyes steady and unblinking, "then there will be no wedding." Andrew cleared his throat but didn't speak, his gaze moving between his parents and me. Lily's fork paused midway to her mouth. Charles's fingers tightened minutely around his wine glass. Margaret let out a soft laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "My dear, I hope you understand the position you're putting yourself in." I slid the second document forward, the one containing the summary of my assets. "I think you understand my position just fine." Silence fell. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked audibly in the pause that followed. Charles finally set his glass down with care, his expression cooling by degrees. "We'll discuss this as a family," he said. "Alone." Andrew's voice was firm when he answered. "No, Dad. We'll discuss it together. All of us." The tension was so sharp it felt as if the air itself might snap. My heartbeat was steady, though the kind of steadiness that comes when you've already decided how far you're willing to go. I kept my hands folded loosely in my lap and waited. Whatever they threw next, I was ready. Charles reached for the contract, his expression neutral, eyes flicking over each page with the slow precision of a man trained to find weaknesses in words. The only sounds were the occasional clink of silverware from Lily's plate and the faint hum of the heating system. His gaze lingered on the sections outlining equal asset protection, shared responsibility for debts, and clear stipulations for division of property in the event of divorce. Margaret leaned forward before he had even reached the midpoint, her manicured fingers drumming against the tablecloth. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "You're making it sound as if you're on the same financial level as Andrew. We both know that's not the case." I kept my voice calm. "Actually, that's exactly the case. Her eyes narrowed. I reached into the folder again and slid a second sheet toward them, the clean-typed summary of my holdings. 9.2 million in total. 7.7 in inherited investments, 1.5 in the current valuation of my company. All verified, all documented. Margaret's hand froze mid-tap. She scanned the page quickly, her lips parting slightly before pressing back together in a thin line. That number can't be right. It is, I said. And it's separate property legally protected before this marriage even takes place. Charles's eyes flicked from the page to my face, measuring. Margaret let out a tight laugh, but it didn't carry the same confidence as before. So what you think that makes you untouchable? Money doesn't buy class. I didn't flinch. No, but it buys lawyers. And it keeps people from thinking they can bully me into signing something one-sided. Andrew shifted in his chair, his jaw set but his gaze locked on his mother. Charles turned another page, slower this time. His breathing had changed, more deliberate, as if weighing the conversation's trajectory. I let a pause hang just long enough to feel the air shift before adding, and while we're discussing fairness, there's something else you should know. Margaret's chin lifted, ready to pounce, but I didn't give her the chance. A few days ago, there was a very dangerous incident. My car's brake line was cut. Fortunately, I found out before anyone was hurt. I've since hired an investigator. That caught Charles's attention in a way nothing else had. His eyes sharpened, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he set the contract down. The investigator found security footage from the day it happened. I continued, my tone steady. It showed someone wearing a jacket from Whitmore and Burke walking near my vehicle minutes before I left. Margaret's smile faltered completely this time, and for the first time all evening she looked at Charles instead of me. I didn't accuse. I didn't need to. The implication was enough. Charles leaned back slowly, his fingers pressed together under his chin. That's a serious allegation. It's not an allegation. It's a fact that I have evidence of. I'm not here to point fingers, unless I have to. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight of them controlling the room. It was the brittle quiet of people recalculating, of power shifting, inch by inch. Margaret reached for her wine glass, her hand trembling just enough for the crystal to catch the light. That's ridiculous, she muttered, but there was no bite in it. Andrew broke the silence, his voice low but firm. This is exactly why we need a fair agreement. We're not going to start a marriage with threats and secrets. Charles didn't respond immediately. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then dropped his gaze back to the contract. The way he studied it now was different, less like a man looking for a flaw and more like someone deciding whether to concede or double down. Lily set down her fork, glancing between her parents and me as if watching a chess match where the outcome was suddenly uncertain. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands folded loosely on the table, but inside I could feel the shift. The current that had been pushing against me since I stepped into this house was easing, even if only slightly. They weren't in control anymore. Not fully. Margaret's voice, when it came, was quieter, almost measured. And if we agree to this new contract, then we move forward, I said. But if not, I walk. And that will be the end of it. No one spoke for several beats. Somewhere down the hall, a grandfather clock chimed, its sound echoing faintly against the high ceilings. Charles lifted his wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it down without looking at anyone. We'll need to review this privately, he said at last. Of course, I answered, though my gaze stayed locked on him. Take all the time you need. I didn't miss the way Margaret's shoulders had drawn, in the way her earlier superiority had thinned into something tighter, less certain. For the first time since I met them, they were the ones reacting to me, not the other way around. Charles exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried weight, then placed the contract neatly back on the table. We'll let our family attorney review this, he said, his tone clipped but not combative. It was as close to a concession as I expected to hear tonight. Margaret's gaze had shifted to her wine glass, tracing the rim with one finger. She didn't meet my eyes again. The bite in her earlier words was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt more like retreat than restraint. Andrew looked from his father to me, then back again, as if gauging whether the moment might suddenly implode. That will be all for tonight, Charles added, already rising from his chair. His voice had the finality of a gavel. The staff moved quietly around us, clearing plates and refilling glasses no one touched. I stood collecting my folder and slipping it into my bag. The conversation was over for now, but the game was far from finished. Andrew escorted me to the front door, his hand warm on the small of my back. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said quietly, and for the first time I believed he meant it. The evening air was cool and carried the faint scent of the cedar trees lining the drive. Evelyn was waiting just outside the gates, leaning against her car with her arms crossed. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pressed a small folded piece of paper into my hand. I glanced down at the neat block letters. A name and beneath it 6 words fired for sabotaging rival client property. I looked up sharply. "Old staff gossip," she said, keeping her voice low. "He worked for the Whitmore's firm about 3 years ago. Got caught messing with a competitor's construction equipment. Charges were dropped, but he was let go quietly." The image of the security footage flashed in my mind, that jacket with Whitmore and Burke stitched across the back. This connected the dots too cleanly to be coincidence. "You're sure?" I asked. "I wouldn't bring it to you otherwise," she replied. And Margaret was the one who pushed to keep him on a while longer, even after the partners wanted him gone. Said he was loyal. Loyal, I repeated, tasting the word. It sounded more like obedient. Evelyn's mouth tightened. "Whatever happened to your car, she knew about it." A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear but from the sharp clarity that came with confirmation. Margaret might not have held the wrench herself, but she had given someone else the space to use it. I folded the paper and slid it into my bag alongside the contract draft. This was no longer just about prenups and pride. This was about a line crossed so deliberately there was no mistaking intent. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward the mansion. "They'll circle the wagons now. Expect them to move fast." "Good," I said. "So will I." The drive back into the city was quiet, the hum of the tires on asphalt giving me space to think. Every piece was falling into place, and for the first time I wasn't just reacting. I was building something. A plan with teeth. By the time I pulled into my building's garage, I knew exactly where the paper Evelyn had given me would go. Harold would get it first thing in the morning. From there, Mark could dig deeper, maybe even pull employment records, internal memos, anything that tied this man closer to Margaret's orders. Upstairs, I set my bag on the kitchen counter and poured a glass of water. The apartment felt different tonight. Not safer, not yet, but less like a waiting room for the next blow. I unfolded the note again, reading the name slowly, committing it to memory. Somewhere out there, this man thought he had done his job and disappeared into the background. He didn't know yet that his past was about to surface. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrew. "Thank you for tonight. I know it wasn't easy. We'll figure this out." I stared at the message for a moment before replying. "We'll see." Sliding the phone face down on the counter, I stood at the window looking out over the dark sweep of the city. The Whitmores thought tonight had been about contracts. They didn't see that the real negotiation had already shifted and the leverage was no longer in their hands. Somewhere in the quiet, I could almost hear Margaret's measured voice from earlier, feigning dismissal of the brake line incident. I wondered if she felt that same edge of unease I'd seen flicker in her eyes when I'd mentioned the investigation. If she didn't yet, she would soon. The morning of the signing broke gray and cool, the kind of weather that made the city feel quieter than usual. I dressed deliberately, choosing a charcoal suit and silk blouse, clothes that carried no softness but left no room for distraction. When I arrived at Whitmore and Burke's downtown office, Andrew was already in the reception area, pacing lightly with his hands in his pockets. He offered a faint smile when he saw me. "Ready?" I nodded and followed him past the receptionist into a glass-walled conference room where Charles and Margaret sat at one end of the long table. Charles was reading a file with unreadable focus. Margaret's posture was perfect, her hands folded neatly over a leather portfolio. She glanced up at me briefly, expression cool and distant. Our attorneys were already there, exchanging low words over the contract copies. The documents were spread across the table in crisp stacks, each page tagged with colored flags where signatures and initials would go. We began with formalities, the lawyers walking us through each section. My heart didn't race this time. I had read the draft 100 times, knew every clause and its weight. When they slid the first set of pages toward me, my pen was steady. It was midway through the review when Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth. Before we finalize, I believe it would be wise to add a clause protecting the family's reputation. The room went still. Charles looked up from his papers but said nothing. I set my pen down and met her gaze. I would be open to that, I said, provided it applies to both sides equally. And it must not be used to hide or excuse any unlawful behavior. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. That seems specific. Specific is the only way agreements work, I replied. We both have reputations to protect. Charles's gaze moved from me to Margaret, then back again. After a beat, he gave a short nod. That's acceptable. Have it drafted in now. The attorneys conferred quickly, scribbling the additional clause in precise legal language. Once both parties approved the wording, the signing resumed. Page after page slid across the table, our pens scratching in the quiet. When the final signature was done, there was a subtle shift in the air. Charles reached for the completed stack, handed it to the firm's paralegal for processing, then rose from his chair. Congratulations, he said in a tone that carried neither warmth nor resentment. Margaret remained seated, her eyes fixed on me in a way that felt like the first unguarded look she had given since we met. It wasn't approval. It wasn't even respect. It was caution. I gathered my bag and reached for an envelope I had placed inside earlier. As the others began to stand, I walked it to Charles and set it on the table in front of him. What is this? He asked. A courtesy, I said. Consider it a reminder that I value safety as much as I value agreements. He studied me for a moment, then picked up the envelope. The seal was intact, my handwriting neat on the front. Inside was a printed copy of the summary from Mark's investigation, the portion that detailed the brake line damage and the employment history of the man Evelyn had named. It was enough to make a point without revealing the full file. Charles didn't open it there. He simply rested his palm over it, his expression unreadable. Margaret's attention flicked between us, and for the first time I saw her guard falter. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she didn't. Andrew stepped closer to me. Ready to go, I nodded, and together we walked out of the room, past the wall of glass that reflected the entire conference table behind us. Charles remained standing, the sealed envelope still under his hand. Margaret sat perfectly still, her gaze following me until the door closed. The elevator ride down was silent, except for the hum of the cables. Andrew glanced at me once, his expression a mix of relief and something else he didn't voice. Outside, the air was sharper, carrying the faint tang of rain. I breathed it in, letting the chill clear my head. The contract was signed, but the real balance of power had shifted in a way no one at that table would admit aloud. I could still feel the weight of Margaret's stare in that final moment, not laced with disdain, but with something far more careful. She had seen enough to know I would not be cornered again. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand that I was not the easy mark she had once believed. Morning light opened over Seattle in a soft wash, the kind that makes the city look newly polished. I woke before my alarm, calm in a way that surprised me. The documents were signed. The envelope had been delivered. I had taken back the ground under my feet. Now, there was only the wedding. At the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, my suite smelled faintly of peonies and steam from the iron. My dress hung by the window, catching a sliver of sun. My mother pinned my hair with steady hands while my father pretended not to get misty in the doorway. The hum of last-minute details moved around us like a tide, but none of it touched the center of me. I slipped into the dress and felt it settle like a promise I had made to myself long before I made it to anyone else. When I stepped into the hallway, the world narrowed to soft carpet and quiet footsteps. Andrew texted that he was downstairs with the officiant and the license. His name on the screen made my chest ease in a way I had not allowed lately. I looked at my reflection one more time, and then I let the door close behind me. The ceremony space glowed under a canopy of white lights. Friends and family turned as the music began, faces soft with expectation. I walked on my father's arm toward Andrew, who stood straighter than I had ever seen him stand. His eyes found mine and stayed there. No one said the words prenup or break line. No one said Whitmore or Burke. Silence did what words could not. It gave us a clean edge to step across. The vows felt simple and exact. We promised to show up when it was easy and when it was not, to tell the truth when it cost us something, to protect what we built together as if it were a living thing. When the officiant said we were married, the room exhaled. Andrew's hands were warm. My heart was steady. At the reception, the ballroom shimmered with glass and laughter. Charles offered a short toast that sounded like diplomacy more than celebration, but there was a nod in my direction that had not been there before. Margaret kept to the edges, a pale blue dress that softened the lines of her posture. When our eyes met across the room, there was no disdain in her look. It read more like calculation tempered by caution. She lifted her glass a fraction, and I did the same. It was not peace, but it was not war. Evelyn slipped in beside me near the dessert table and squeezed my hand once, quick and fierce. "You look like yourself," she said, and I knew she meant more than the dress. Olivia moved through the crowd with the quiet ease of someone who knows every door and hinge in a house. When she passed me, she gave the smallest of nods, as if to say that the ground had shifted in the direction it should. Andrew and I danced while the band threaded old soul songs into the room. He leaned close enough for me to hear him over the music. "Thank you for not giving up on this," he said. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I rested my cheek against his shoulder and let myself believe that we had crossed a threshold together and not alone. Later, when the lights dimmed and the band took a break, I stepped into the hallway for air. My phone buzzed with a message from Mark. "All done. Call me when you can." I slipped into a quiet lounge and dialed. His voice was steady. "We have a name. The man in the jacket is Daniel Cole, former facilities tech who did contract work for the firm about 3 years ago. Fired after a sabotage incident at a client site. He has since been picking up off the books work for a property group with ties to Garrett Holdings." I asked the question without breathing. "Any link to Margaret?" "Not direct," he said, "but there is a chain. Cole received payments through a consultant who used to sit on a charitable board with her. We have phone records that show contact between them in the same week your brake line was cut. Not enough for a courtroom by itself, but enough to make a very loud noise if we needed it." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Is there anything else?" "One more thing." We pulled a second angle from a neighboring camera. "It shows Cole approaching your car with a small case. The timeline matches the cut. The footage and the records are in a neat package. You can choose how to use it." When I thanked him, he told me he had already placed a copy in a safe I could access at his office and another on a secure drive. "Sleep tonight," he said. "You earned it." I ended the call and stood looking at my hands. They were steady. I thought about calling the police. I thought about sending the file to a reporter. I thought about the way Margaret's gaze had changed in that conference room when she understood that the envelope on the table could open into something much larger than a contract dispute. When I walked back into the ballroom, the cake cutting was about to begin. Andrew laced his fingers through mine and grinned like an uncomplicated man on his wedding night. We did the thing with the first slice and the applause and the kiss. While the room cheered, I turned enough to catch Charles watching me. I held his eyes calmly, then let them drift to the sealed envelope he had taken home. He looked away first. As the night wound down, Andrew and I changed into our going-away clothes and hugged the people we loved most. Margaret approached last. For a second, I wondered if she would speak. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her wrap and said that the car was waiting at the front. Her voice held no frost. Only distance. That was fine. Distance was honest. In the quiet of the elevator, Andrew took my hand again. "We did it," he said, soft enough for just me to hear. I smiled and did not say that doing it once was not the same as doing it always. I chose to live in the moment we had earned. We spent our first night as a married couple in a suite that looked out over the city lights. The room smelled like lilies and clean linen. While Andrew showered, I sat at the desk and wrote a brief note to Mark authorizing him to place the full file in a safe deposit box under my name and Harold's. I added a second note to Harold asking him to hold a sealed copy with my will. Then I closed my laptop and put my phone away. I had made my choice. I would not prosecute for now. I would keep the insurance and the power that came with it. If there was ever another line crossed, I would not hesitate. In the morning, Seattle was clear and bright, the kind of day that makes you believe in new starts. We had breakfast by the window and made the small talk of people who are exhausted and happy. We did not mention the word prenup. We did not say break line. We talked about a hike we wanted to take later in the week and about how the house we chose together would look with the bookshelves we had been meaning to buy. In the days that followed, boundaries began to take their shape. Sunday dinners would be once a month, not a weekly summons. Business would stay out of our home. If a family decision touched our marriage, Andrew and I would speak as a unit or not at all. Some of these rules were said aloud. Some were enforced by silence and a look between us that meant we were remembering the hard way we had learned them. A week later, I met Charles in a quiet corner of a downtown hotel bar. He had asked for 20 minutes. He thanked me for the professionalism with which the signing had been handled. He said he hoped we could move forward. I listened, and then I told him that the file existed in duplicate and that I trusted he would make sure no one in his orbit came near my car or my company again. He held my gaze and said that would not be a problem. When we stood to leave, he shook my hand. It was not warmth, it was an understanding. Back at the office, my team at Bright Path gathered to celebrate a new district partnership. We took a photo in the lobby and I looked at their faces and felt something anchor me. This was mine, built without shortcuts. Built without asking for permission from people who only understood power when it was used against them. Sometimes I think about the road where the brakes failed and the way the car finally stopped with just feet to spare. I think about the tunnel Evelyn mapped for me, the exit you only need if you are trapped on someone else's ground. Most days now I do not need the map. The ground I stand on is mine. If you have ever been pushed to the edge by people who thought they could decide your life for you, if you have ever had to draw a line and hold it with both hands, I would like to hear your story. Tell me where you are watching from and what you stood up for. If this journey spoke to you, tap like and share it with someone who needs a little courage today. And if you want more stories about taking back your voice and your choices, stay with me and subscribe so we can walk the next one together.